We just like to take this moment to thank our sponsors for OPWA. Before we begin our webinar, I'm just going to provide a brief intro on OPWA, who we are and how you can join us. So OPWA, we're a not-for-profit organization of professional public works practitioners. The Ontario chapter is one of 63 chapters that make up the American Public Works Association. We have over 500 members who are employed by governments, municipalities, consultants, utilities, contractors, and suppliers. And the Ontario chapter is also supported with two regional branches, the West Central branch in the Niagara region and the Ottawa branch in the Ottawa Valley branch in the Ottawa area. Our mission statement reads, Connecting the Public Works Community. We provide our members opportunities to connect through workshops, conferences, and social events. And another great way of connecting with these communities is to join OPWA and our committees. There are 9 committees within OPWA, so there's always opportunities to match your interests, and your ideas and volunteer assistance are wanted. If you're not yet a member of OPWA, we encourage you to take a look at our website to learn more about becoming a member. Oh, sorry. Let me just share my screen again. These are some of the upcoming chapter events that we have. In October, we have the popular Right-of-Way Management Conference, and in November, the Technology Showcase. So for our webinar today, just a few housekeeping items. All of your microphones have been muted and cameras will remain off. We encourage that if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box on your screen where you'll be able to fill them out, and our speakers will respond to the questions at the end of the webinar. So the duration is about 1 hour. If we have a lot of questions, we might slightly go over that. However, we'll see how we go. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So Jeff Scorgie is a partner in the construction practice group at Weirfolds. Jeff focuses on drafting and negotiating contracts and advising on other front-end aspects of construction projects, including procurement and tendering, and navigate issues that may arise throughout the life of the project. Jeff co-chairs a popular webinar series, Tools for Success, and he previously served as an instructor on the Law and Construction Contracts course at George Brown College. Kathleen Gregus is an associate in the construction practice group at Weirfolds. Kathleen has experience reviewing, drafting, and negotiating a wide variety of construction contracts and providing strategic advice on procurement processes. Kathleen is actively involved in the Canadian Association of Women in Construction. Both Kathleen and Jeff work with owners, developers, contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, and consultants. So with that, we'd like to welcome Jeff and Kathleen.
That's great. Thanks, Tricia, and thanks to the OPWA for having us back. It's great to join you here, and we're excited to talk about the new CCDC contracts that have come out this year. So we'll just dive right in. So just a quick kind of refresher in terms of who the CC or what the CCDC is. So CCDC stands for the Canadian Construction Documents Committee, and it is a organization that publishes the industry standard construction contracts that are widely used across Canada, so in all of the provinces. And what is unique about the CCDC in terms of organizations that create and publish industry contracts is that the CCDC really is a consensus organization in the sense that it includes on it stakeholders and members from both sides of the industry. So it has members on it from the ownership side as well as the contractor side. So for that reason, the CCDC does have a pretty good reputation in terms of creating fairly balanced industry standard construction contracts. So in terms of the updates, these are the 4 CCDC contracts that were recently published and released this year. So these are updates to existing prior editions of these contracts. So we have the CCDC 5A, the Construction Management Contract for Services, the CCDC 5B, also construction management, but it's for services and construction. The CCDC 17, that's the stipulated price trade contract, and the CCDC 30, integrated project delivery contract. So we'll go through the changes that have been made to each of these four contracts. Now, in terms of kind of just from a big picture standpoint, these contracts are really they're part of a trend of updates that CCDC started back in 2020. So at the end of 2020, CCDC published the new CCDC 2 stipulated price contract, which some of you may be familiar with or have used on some of your projects. And it made a lot of significant changes, a lot of which we're seeing reflected in these new documents, in these new four contracts that we're going to talk about today. So a lot of the changes are reflecting that same trend of changes we saw in the CCDC 2 2020. And so in terms of kind of what's the big picture, these are kind of the main points you'll see us talking about today. So generally, the contracts that were released in 2025 reflect, a general alignment with prompt payment legislation. So a lot of the provinces have been slowly introducing prompt payment legislation. Of course, in Ontario, we have the prompt payment rules that were introduced as part of the Construction Act updates that happened in October of 2019. So although the CCDC contracts are used across Canada, the payment terms, as we'll come to, the payment windows, invoicing requirements, have been revised to reflect this new defined term in the contracts called payment legislation, which is defined essentially by reference to any legislation that applies in the applicable province that your contract relates to, that governs payment under construction contracts. So in Ontario, of course, that means the Ontario prompt payment rules that are part of the Construction Act. So that those updates have been made. As I said, this new definition of payment legislation. The payment window, the payment time frame, as we'll see, has been revised to align with the prompt payment time frame that is imposed on owners, which is 28 calendar days. Another significant change is the standardization of the completion milestone. So we're generally seeing in the CCDC contracts, again, this started first with the CCDC 2 2020, a shift away from substantial performance as the key contractual milestone that the contractor has to hit in terms of their schedule obligations. So substantial performance still exists. It's still relevant. It still plays a key role in the CCDC 17 that Kathleen's going to talk about. But Ready-for-Takeover really is the kind of foundational and core contractual milestone that now has a lot more importance in the contract. So we'll kind of talk through what Ready-for-Takeover is and how it's relevant. Flexibility is also a key element here. We're seeing a shift towards a bit more flexibility. The contracts are a bit more dynamic. So we see that with Ready-for-Takeover itself. It's a contractual milestone, whereas substantial performance was very much defined in the old CCDC contracts by reference to provincial lien legislation, which always made it challenging to modify because, of course, you can't modify a statute's definition of substantial performance, even though owners tried very much to do that in their contracts by amending definitions of substantial performance of the work. But what Ready-for-Takeover provides is a much more flexible contractual milestone that an owner that is, issuing contracts through a tender or through an RFP will be able to modify through supplemental conditions to tweak and modify to suit the needs of its particular project in terms of what that owner is looking for in terms of closeout documents and any other completion requirements. Early occupancy is now also has been introduced into the contracts and we'll talk through how that features now in these new agreements. So there is a recognition that an owner may occupy part of a project early. And there's now also some expanded termination suspension rights for owners under the contracts, again, which we'll talk about, particularly in the CCDC 5A and the 5B. There's been some changes to risk allocation. So one new and very important change is that the old CCDC contracts had liability caps on the parties that limited their liability, but they were framed explicitly as being tied to the parties' indemnity obligations. That's been replaced with kind of more general global liability caps on the parties. And we'll talk about what those are, as well as the various exclusions to the liability caps. And then another significant change, which we shouldn't downplay, is that the schedules to the contracts, particularly the 5A and the 5B, have are now available and have now been provided in Word format, so that that will be more easily customizable for a given project team that is using these CCDC contracts on their project. So that's kind of a big picture snapshot of what's changed. And so with that, we will dive into the contracts, and we'll kind of take them each one at a time and just talk through the specific changes. So Kathleen, do you want to start us off with the CCDC 5A here?
Yeah. Thanks everyone for having us. We're really excited to be back to speak with you again. So the first contract that we wanted to talk to you about that has had some pretty significant updates made to it is the CCDC 5A. And that is a construction management contract for services. So that's the standard form contract between an owner and a construction manager, for which the work is actually performed by trade contractors. So the owner enters into separate contracts with trade contractors directly to perform the work. And the construction manager under the 5A acts as the owner's agent in providing advisory services and administering and overseeing the contracts between the owner and the trade contractors. And so one of the first important changes we wanted to talk to you about was a reorganization or restructuring of this fee for services for the construction manager under the 5A. And so the really big or the importance of this change is that it really just provides for more optionality. So they have divided out the fee for services with respect to pre-construction, construction, and post-construction. The fee for pre-construction in the standard form, it's a fixed fee, but then for construction and post-construction, they've included an option for it to be fixed or a percentage fee. And so it just creates some better flexibility. It redefines the fee structure to better align with how the project phases actually go or actually play out. And so it's a clear allocation of the fee and the entitlement, and then it just provides for some more flexibility to align with phases. So the next thing that we want to talk to you about is payment and invoicing. So as Jeff mentioned, there's been this big shift, which I'm sure many of you have seen or understand, to prompt payment. And so there's been a shift in the CCDC documents, including the 5A, to align with prompt payment legislation. And so one important thing to note is that monthly payment applications are required under the new 5A. Previously, that wasn't an express requirement for monthly invoicing. So that's the default now. They've also included various acknowledgements that are sprinkled throughout the contract that just really give a nod to the fact that these payment legislations or regimes exist and that these contracts need to comply with them. And application dates, the applications for payment are to be dated the last day of the month. So that's something new. So really, it's just a big shift to align with the prompt payment legislation or the payment legislation that now exists in various jurisdictions. And they've also included a new a revised right on behalf of the owner to suspend or terminate if the owner is unwilling or unable to proceed with the contract. So at any time, the owner can suspend the project or they can terminate the contract if they're unwilling or unable to proceed. And so this is important not only because it's a new right for the owner, but because it carries with it some meaningful implications in terms of the compensation that's due to the contractor if you choose to, or if an owner chooses to exercise this right. So a contractor under the new 5A is entitled to compensation for all services performed and other direct damages they've sustained. And that's pretty broad. The way that that's worded in the actual contract is broadly phrased. And so that's something that when we were looking over the updates, we noticed is something that owners should really consider when they're entering into these types of contracts, whether that's something that you would like to amend through supplementary conditions. They've also built in a payment, like a break fee under GC 5.5. So essentially, this is meant to provide the contractor with some, or the construction manager with some sort of compensation for their lost profits. And so you're able to suspend as well, but if the suspension goes over 30 days, then the contractor or the construction manager will have the ability to terminate the contract. So they include these new rights of termination and suspension, but they carry with them some implications in terms of compensation and the contractor's right to eventually terminate. So just some things to consider. So the next thing that we want to talk to you about, which is one of the big changes, the really important changes, especially with respect to the 5A and how it interacts with the 17, is the shift towards Ready-for-Takeover. And Ready-for-Takeover under the 5A is framed as being applicable to the entire project. So that's the main contractual completion milestone applicable to the project as a whole. And so in the contract, they've defined what ready for takeover or items that have to be achieved, prerequisites that have to be achieved for this milestone to be achieved. And so we've listed them on the slides. And so what this does is it creates a clear transition point for the obligations of the contractor, of the construction manager, and the owner. And what's really important, which I'll talk about more extensively when we get to the 17, is that because this milestone is framed as being applicable to the entire project, that means it applies to all of the trade contracts that operate that exist also on the project where a 5A is entered into. And so it's going to be really important that there's alignment between the 5A, this milestone date, and all the requirements that go with it, with the trade contracts that are entered into as well. So I'll talk about that more when we get to the 17, but that's something that we don't want to blaze over. And so, as Jeff mentioned, we've also seen the inclusion of new limitation of liability. So under the 5A, for insured losses, it's limited at the required insurance coverage amount. For uninsured losses, it's limited to the greater of the fee for services, or 2 million. So it's subject to a 20 million maximum. It only applies with respect to direct damages, direct losses, so no indirect, consequential, punitive, or exemplary damages. And there's various exclusions. So this liability cap applies except with respect to that little list at the bottom of the screen. So third-party claims, claims arising from willful misconduct, fraudulent behavior, criminal acts, those types of things, as well as claims arising from a party's violation of applicable laws. And so again, this is a really important update, but it also has implications in terms of what to think about in considering if you're amending the standard form, what you would want the liability cap to be, depending on the amount of risk associated with the project, the schedule implications, the parties involved, various different factors. So we've listed a couple other updates that are important, but we just are going to go through them quite quickly. So they've removed some of the language related to cash allowances. The dispute resolution section now has been expanded to recognize the fact that adjudication is now an increasingly prevalent form of dispute resolution. They have included editable word schedules for various different in various different forms. And then they've also changed the language related to health and safety. So this is actually quite interesting. And this change, upon reflection, really reflects what was actually happening in the industry anyway, or what is happening in the industry. So previously, the 5A said that the owner shall be responsible for construction health and safety at the place of the project. this language is now changed or has been revised. And so now it reads the owner shall comply with the health and safety precautions and programs established at the place of the work. And so what this really is a nod to the fact or recognition of the fact that the construction manager is typically the one who is responsible for construction health and safety on a project. And I think that's all for this one.
Yep. That's great. Okay, and now for the 5B. So the CCDC 5B, of course, is similar, but it's also a construction management contract. But as you can see here on the screen, we've kind of tried to sketch out just a little diagram that kind of reflects the contract structure. So, of course, the significant difference between CCDC 5B and a 5A is that with the 5B, the construction manager holds all the contracts directly with the subcontractors and the suppliers, as opposed to in the case of the 5A, where the owner holds all those contracts directly. And I think this is a very important update because the 5B is a very commonly, it's become, I mean, it has been used significantly since it was introduced in 2010, and it is just becoming more and more common. We're even seeing more construction management projects in the public sector as well. Municipalities have been trying them, and still seeing a lot of them in the private sector. So it's a very, very commonly used project delivery model. So just diving into the main changes, one of the main changes, which I think is great and very welcome, is they have changed how the fee structure is set up. So the previous CCDC 5B 2010 edition had kind of a confusing fee structure where there was one fee for the services, kind of the construction management advisory services, and then a separate fee for the construction work itself. But they were both referred to as the construction manager's fee. It was kind of a confusing, in my view at least, a confusing way to set up the construction manager's fee. And very often that section, Article A5 of the CCDC 5B, was deleted and or replaced or significantly revised through supplementary conditions to reflect the actual fee structure that was agreed upon by the parties. In the 2025 version, they've changed it so that there's now a separate fee that's not divided by services and construction, but more divided by phases. So there is now a fee for the pre-construction phase and a fee for the construction phase. So I think this is a great change, very welcome, and I think it's just a little more logical and kind of reflects at least a lot of the construction management deals that we see, and how they're often commonly structured, where you'll have typically a fixed pre-construction fee, and then for the construction phase, that compensation will often be structured as a percentage fee or maybe a fixed fee as well. But that's often where the dividing line is. It's between pre-construction and construction. So I think that's a good change. A new term has been introduced into the CCDC 5B of contract price. Now, don't be confused by that because, of course, the CCDC 5B is not a fixed price contract. It's not a stipulated price or a lump sum contract like a CCDC 2. But they are using the same term now. They're using the term contract price, but they've defined it differently. So in the 5B, it's basically this global all-encompassing term that refers to the construction manager's fee for pre-construction, construction, the reimbursable expenses it will charge during pre-construction, and the costs of the work that it will charge during the construction phase. So it's kind of a global, all-encompassing one-stop shop term that can be used throughout the contract to refer to essentially all forms of compensation the construction manager is getting during the contract. The scope section has also been revised and kind of reformatted and recast a little bit. So now there's a bit of a more clearer distinction between the pre-construction and the construction phase. So the construction management advisory services that the construction manager is providing are now a bit more cleanly delineated between pre-construction and construction. That's kind of set out in separate schedules that are attached to the contract. The application for payment. So payment and invoicing has been revised, and I touched on this at the beginning. This is, of course, a key theme in all of these contracts. So the payment timelines have now been revised to align with provincial prompt payment rules. So we're now seeing the owner's payment obligation is now clearly described as being to pay within 28 calendar days of receipt of the construction manager's invoice. So that lines up exactly with what the prompt payment rules are in Ontario, which is an owner under the statute has to pay within, unless it disputes an invoice through a notice of non-payment, it has to pay within 28 calendar days of receipt of a contractor's proper invoice. So there's now clear alignment between those provincial prompt payment rules um, and the CCDC's payment terms. And as other provinces introduce prompt payment legislation across the country, I can't say for certain, but my expectation is they will probably adopt the same 28 calendar day payment window. So that this change will probably see continued consistency with prompt payment legislation as it rolls across other provinces. Monthly payment applications have to be submitted. So the original 5B was a bit more flexible. It talked about invoices being submitted on a monthly basis or as the parties may otherwise agree upon. In the new updated form, monthly payment applications is just kind of clearly more set as the default. And again, payment applications for payment have to be submitted in compliance with payment legislation. So again, that defined term is now a key feature here in the payment clauses. So, and just a quick refresher, we talked about this the last time we were here at the OPWA, but the Ontario prompt payment rules, of course, require that a contractor's invoice has to meet certain requirements in order to qualify as a proper invoice under the statute. And those requirements are set out in Section 6 of the Construction Act. So again, here in Ontario, when you're looking at these new clauses in the 5B, basically the effect of this is that the construction manager is going to have to ensure that its invoice not only complies with whatever requirements are in the CCDC 5B's invoicing clauses, as they may have been updated and supplemented by the owner's supplementary conditions, but they will also have to comply with the requirements in the Construction Act's prompt payment rules with respect to proper invoice prerequisites. So they're kind of incorporating that by reference with that language. And then, as I said, the payment obligation on the owner has been recast and realigned to be consistent with prompt payment rules. So historically, under the old CCDC 5B, the owner's payment obligation was much more linked to the consultant's receipt of the contractor's payment application and the consultant's role in certifying invoices and payment certification. Payment certification isn't really a feature in the prompt payment rules under the Construction Act statute and in the other prompt payment rules in the other provinces. So that's, as I said, been recast so that the owner's payment obligation is 28 calendar days from receipt of the construction manager's invoice. Ready for takeover, as I said, is now this new milestone that has been added to the CCDC 5B. And as I touched on at the beginning, it very much replaces substantial performance of the work as the primary completion milestone that the contractor or the construction manager has to hit. And so there's this whole new section in the CCDC 5B dealing with what ready for takeover is and what those prerequisites are, which Kathleen touched on in the context of the 5A, very similar in the context of the 5B. What I think is really important to underscore here is the second kind of bullet here, and that is the construction manager's schedule obligation. This is, in my view, a very significant change from the CCDC 5B 2010 edition. In the 2010 edition, the construction manager's schedule obligations were framed as they essentially stated that the construction manager would start the services by a stipulated date and then would continue in accordance with any schedule that was set out in Article A3 of the CCDC 5B contract. So the 5B didn't exactly have a specific date by which the construction manager had to hit substantial performance. Um, you would, if you wanted to provide for that as an owner, you would have to stipulate that specifically in Article A3, which is the description of the project, or you would have to amend that clause through supplementary conditions, which owners often did, but the standard form itself, the 2010 edition, didn't actually have a date that you would stipulate, a date you would insert for the achievement of substantial performance by a specific date. This has been changed now in the new 5B. So now it's a little more clear. And the construction manager's schedule obligations are, in my view, now expressed a little more firmly. So the construction manager will have to start the pre-construction services by a stipulated date. That will be filled in. It has to continue performance of the pre-construction services in accordance with the construction schedule, assuming one would get attached to the contract or be included as part of the contract. And then here's the critical distinction. The construction manager will now have to achieve ready for takeover by a stipulated date. So that will be actually inserted into the PDF form itself. Now, if you leave that blank, there is a default. It will default to then ready for takeover will just have to be achieved by a date subsequently agreed upon by the parties mutually. But the significant distinction really is that there now is a clear date by which the construction manager will have to hit ready for takeover, and that will be in the standard PDF form, assuming the parties fill it out. So, assuming they fill out that section. So that is a important update in the new form. Early occupancy has also been added as a concept. This was something that was often added by owners through supplementary conditions, but it's now been reflected in the 5B form itself. So we now see that the owner can occupy all or part of the work prior to the construction manager achieving ready for takeover. Now, various preconditions have to be met. The construction manager has to agree. That's condition one. Now, the construction manager can't withhold its agreement unreasonably, so it does have to act reasonably in providing its agreement. But also any prior approval of authorities having jurisdiction. So any kind of occupancy requirements from local any municipal occupancy requirements will have to be satisfied. Once the owner does take early occupancy, say of part of the project, then care of that part of the work will pass to the owner, and the warranty period for that part of the work will also begin to run. So this early occupancy is there, but it's as an option, but it does have significant repercussions if an owner is going to want to exercise it. In terms of termination, so we see a similar termination and suspension right given to the owner in the 5B as in the 5A. The owner can suspend or terminate if it is unable or unwilling to proceed with the project. But the construction manager does have entitlement there to compensation. It'll have to get paid for all the work it's done, and it will have to get reimbursed for the direct damages it incurs as a result of that termination. And then there is also this kind of break fee concept that is built into the articles of the agreement that you would fill in the PDF form. So that's there as well, similar to the 5A. So this new termination and suspension right is built into the 5B. So that's something new. The limitation of liability, again, similar to the 5A. This is a common theme across all the contracts. These have kind of been recast and as general limits of liability as opposed to what they were historically in the old contract forms, as I mentioned at the beginning, where they were very much more liability caps tied to the parties' indemnity obligations. These are now framed more as general liability caps on the parties' liability generally under the contract. So for insured losses, there's a liability cap there that's tied to the insurance coverage. For uninsured losses, there's a liability cap there, which you can see on the screen. And again, there's, similar to the 5A, there's an exclusion of indirect, consequential, punitive, and exemplary damages. And these are damages that are fairly commonly excluded in commercial agreements. This was something that was in the CCDC. It was first introduced in the CCDC 2 2020. It wasn't this exclusion of these types of damages was not in the prior contract forms. So it is something new that we're seeing kind of introduced consistently across all these new contracts. There are these exclusions to the liability caps there you can see on the screen. So again, a lot of these are the common kind of commercial exclusions to liability caps that you'll see. My suspicion is that you will see a lot of supplementary conditions modifying these terms, and you'll probably see a fair bit of negotiation during procurement. You'll probably see a lot of bidder comments, proponent comments on these clauses if they're getting modified by supplementary conditions. So I think this will be a hot spot in terms of during the procurement stage and contract negotiation stage, but I think these are welcome changes because I think they're generally more consistent with what we're seeing in modern construction contracts. There's a few additional updates worth mentioning. There is a reference to now a new execution plan that the owner may require from the construction manager. There's the treatment of subcontractor costs and how those are framed as a reimbursable cost of the work has been changed slightly. So notably, there is reference to the owner having prior approval over the pricing mechanism of subcontracts. When I read that, I interpret that as essentially suggesting basically that the construction manager will need to be getting the owner's approval over the kind of pricing structure of subcontracts, i.e. stipulated price subcontracts is at a cost plus, subcontracts is a cost plus with a guaranteed maximum price contract, is it a time and materials subcontract. So that has been added, as well as there's some modifications in terms of the construction manager's entitlement for costs associated with subcontract performance failures. So there's been some slight, subtle but important changes made to that clause in the cost of the work section. The options that are have always been a key feature of the construction management contract. So that is the option to convert the construction management contract into a stipulated price contract or into a guaranteed maximum price contract. Those options, they're still there. They're still part of the CCDC 5B contract, but they've been relocated into appendices. So they're now kind of all relocated into appendices that are attached to the 5B. So kind of a more organizational change to the contract. And then we see a bit of an expansion on the owner's audit, right? So the 5B, of course, because it's a cost plus contract, the owner does have this audit right built into it that is different from something like the CCDC2. The owner has a right to see backup documentation, again, because it's a cost plus, an open book contract. The prior 2010 edition, that audit window was pretty short. It was only 60 days. That was something many owners were commonly extending through supplementary conditions. So we've now just seen that. I think this change, again, has just kind of been an adjustment to reflect kind of the reality of what you see in modern construction contracts where the owner is just granted a bit of a longer duration in terms of its audit rights over the construction manager's pricing records and information. So that's the 5B. I would say that a lot of updates there. So, but I think what I would say on the whole is I think most of them are fairly welcome changes. Again, it's a very widely used contract, so it'll be interesting to see how the new contract is adopted and used in the industry. But on the whole, I think those are probably some pretty good changes that, again, bring the contract more in line with modern legislation, like prompt payment legislation and modern industry practices. So that's the 5B. Now, Kathleen, do you want to take us through the 17?
Yeah, so the 17 is actually closely related to the 5A, which I spoke about a little bit ago. So the CCDC 17 is a stipulated price contract for trade contractors on construction management projects. So it's the standard contract that's entered into between an owner and trade contractors to perform work for a predetermined fixed price, typically. And this type of contract is used where a project is being performed under a CCDC 5A construction management method. And so one of the most important changes that we have recognized and want to talk to you about is, again, the shift towards ready for takeover as being the central completion milestone, contractual completion milestone. So ready for takeover in the CCDC 5A is framed as being applicable to the entire project. Unlike in the CCDC 17, that also exists. But unlike in the CCDC 2, for example, where they've discarded that previously used substantial performance milestone, that milestone has been maintained in the 17. And so what this essentially means is CCDC is saying, okay, trade contractor, you need to start work by X date. You need to finish your contract by the substantial performance date included. And that is critical for the entire project to obtain ready for takeover. And so what's really important is making sure that the ready for takeover date or all of the milestone dates that are used in the trade contracts, so the 17, are consistent with all of the other trade contracts used on the project, as well as the CCDC 5A. And so the really important piece is that they speak to each other. And so unlike, a typical 2 type contract where the entire scope of the project is covered by this one contract, these trade contracts are just dealing with a specific scope that need to attain substantial performance by a specific date so that the overall project milestone can be achieved by ready for takeover. And so from an owner perspective, it's really important that there's alignment. And we see a potential for situations where trade contracts are being negotiated at different times or entered into at different times. And there's a risk that there might be misalignment between the dates included. And while it seems like a small thing, it's actually really important in terms of each contractor and the overall schedule obligations on the project. And so the next thing we want to talk about was early occupancy, which is similar in terms of the way it's been structured in this contract to other contracts that we've spoken about already. But practically with this contract, the 17, which is the trade contractor contract, is that for early occupancy to be permitted before ready for takeover, the trade contractors affected by the early occupancy need to agree. As Jeff mentioned before, this agreement can't be unreasonably withheld, but practically this could mean that there's a lot of trade contractors implicated. So an owner wanting to exercise this right of early occupancy will have to consider who the trade contractors are who will be impacted, and whether or not they're able to actually obtain that agreement or consent for them to exercise that right. And then like in the other situation that Jeff talked about, prior approval from authorities having jurisdiction is also required. And then we've also included the implications of what that means if they take early occupancy. So they're deemed to take over that part of the work. The owner is liability for care of that work, that portion passes to the owner, and the warranty period for that part of the work begins to run. So it reflects the shift to ready for takeover and all of the other contracts, but because of the way that the 17 and the 5A speak to each other and are used in tandem, it creates just a really important practical consideration when you're entering into and administering these forms of contracts. So another important change, which we spoke about before, is that there's been alignment again to the payment obligations set out in applicable payment legislation. So the submission of invoices, the requirements around submitting the invoices to the owner, the timing of payment and receipt of invoices has been aligned. So again, we just see a repeated shift towards prompt payment and the requirements under payment legislation. And then health and safety, an interesting change in the 17 as well. So the construction manager is described as being responsible for establishing and maintaining health and safety precautions and programs. So again, that reflects what's practically done in the industry, or what we see being done very often in the industry. But the owner is responsible for causing the trade contractor to comply with those health and safety requirements. And so even though in the contract there's a recognition that the construction manager is the one who's in charge of that, there is still an obligation on the owner to ensure that there's compliance. And then again here, they've introduced the limitation of liability, which applies in a similar way to the other contracts. So there's a specific cap that applies to insured losses and uninsured losses, as well as how this works with direct losses. And as Jeff mentioned, this is again another place where we'll probably see lots of changes done through supplementary conditions, and then various exclusions. One of the notable exclusions, many of these exclusions track each other throughout the different contracts, but one that's specific to this one is the bottom point. So claims from damages for latent defects not discoverable. So you'll see a lot of consistency in the way that these liability caps or limitations of liability apply, but depending on the type of contract or the parties involved, there are some specific exclusions that have been acknowledged in the drafting of the standard form contracts. And so that takes us to IPD.
Yeah. So this is we've saved the best for last. So this is very much the new kid on the block in terms of project delivery models, contract models. So much so that we thought the diagram for how this contract works deserves its own slide, because it is very different. Some of you might have experience with it. It's still, I would say, quite uncommon, but the IPD, Integrated Project Delivery, is gaining some traction in Canada. We're seeing more IPD projects slowly rolling out. So it is a very interesting, very unique project delivery model. So I'll just provide a quick refresher for those of you who aren't familiar with it. But it is basically this somewhat bizarre contractual framework where there is one main contract where the owner, the consultant, and the general contractor are all party to this one contract, as well as any other IPD parties. Now, that's a defined term, and that will depend on the specific project and who those other parties are, but they will often be, some of the other big sub-consultant disciplines and some of the other big subcontractors, maybe the mechanical, electrical subcontractors, that sort of thing. Some of the big design subconsultants. They're all party to this one contract. So it's a very unique contract methodology, and a full discussion and explanation of how IPD works is unfortunately beyond the scope of this talk. So that's kind of the general background. There's also what's also fundamental to the IPD framework is that the parties are very much all contributing to a risk or a profit pool that is kept until the end of the job. And so the concept is really trying to drive alignment of incentives, where all parties are incentivized to have a project that finishes on time and on budget. And it's very much trying to achieve a win-win situation where, the consultant is incentivized to help the contractor, who's incentivized to help the owner, and all vice versa. You're all everybody's rowing in the same direction. And so by all putting your profit at risk, essentially, until the end of the job. And so that's at a very, very, very high level how the CCDC 30 works, how integrated project delivery works. And then here's just kind of a snapshot of some of the changes, which I'll just go through very briefly, just so we finish on time, and so that we can answer any questions that come in. But At a high level, the contract has been, a lot of changes have been made. So one of which is they've kind of, the contract format has been restructured. So segment A now is the validation phase. So this is kind of this collaborative planning phase to test essentially the owner's, test viability against the owner's budget and schedule. Segment B is then the project execution phase. So this really covers design, finalization, procurement, and construction, as well as the warranty phase, actually. So that's kind of the second phase of the project. And then segment C is the third kind of segment of the contract, and that's the general articles, and they apply across phases. So they cover the profit pool, reimbursable expenses, how that works, overhead notices, payment mechanisms, kind of all the kind of general provisions that apply across the across both phases of the project. New collaboration tools have been introduced into the contract, so there's a reference to this IPD advisor. So this is an optional facilitator that would be exist during the validation phase. So there's some new flexibility there to appoint an advisor with expertise in IPD practices to guide the team. There's reference to the big room. So this is this important concept, this co-location and shared information environment where all the parties are meeting and planning and problem solving, kind of trying to drive that continuous improvement of processes. So that's expressly required now. And then there's clauses that are embedded with respect to lean tools and key personnel. So those are now expressly included and embedded in the contract. Other updates, so the validation phase, there's some greater detail on the reporting requirements. Prompt payment, of course, again, tracks into this contract as well. So the payment terms have been adjusted to comply with the provincial prompt payment legislation. So seeing those same updates there. Dispute resolution has been changed. This is also a whole section that's quite unique in the IPD world, which again is kind of beyond the scope in terms of how disputes operate in an IPD context here. But suffice to say, the timelines have been clarified in the new contract, and again, a reference to adjudication has been made in this contract as well. Of course, given that adjudication is this new statutory dispute resolution process that we're seeing introduced in various provinces, including Ontario, of course. Ready-for-Takeover milestone has been adopted in this contract, just like the other three, as really the key project milestone. So it's integrated into the IPD framework. And again, that, like the other contracts, really marks the transition into the warranty period. And is, that's where this kind of a structured handover happens. So Ready-for-Takeover is a key feature in this contract as well. Early occupancy provisions have been adopted and added for the, kind of adopted to the IPD context. Some other, kind of miscellaneous changes. The risk pool that I mentioned at the beginning, that's been renamed, recharacterized as the profit pool. There's this concept of added value incentive items. So these are now items that can now be selected during construction phase and added kind of post-design. So I think just kind of expanding flexibility beyond design stage only. There's this recognition of concept of amendments. So instead of change orders, the amendments, the concept here is the amendments are what would be used to make key adjustments to things like the target cost, the milestones, the profit pool. That all has to be formally agreed upon using these amendments. And then some other changes as well. The reimbursable costs have been expanded in a schedule. They've been kind of broadened. And transparency and audit protocols have been strengthened a little bit. So there's enhanced access to records and some other terms dealing with audit and transparency there. And then again, the editable standalone schedules has been included as well. So again, it is a consistent theme across all these across all these contracts, where these schedules are being provided in editable Microsoft Word format. So providing for a bit more flexibility and customization. So that is it for a walkthrough of the 4 contracts and the key changes. Just before our last slide here to wrap it up is just what I would say is kind of the key takeaways is that I think we've seen an updating to fee structure. So that's particularly relevant for the CCDC 5A and the 5B, the two construction management contracts. Ready-for-Takeover has clearly been adopted as this key main project milestone, right? So that's largely replaced substantial performance of the work as the key contractual completion milestone, except for the CCDC 17 that Kathleen talked about, where substantial performance is still very much important as a completion milestone that the trade contractor has to hit. We've seen across all contracts alignment of the invoicing and payment terms with provincial prompt payment legislation. We've seen changes to the limitations of liability and liability caps. There's these new termination and suspension rights that have been given to the owner in the construction management contracts, the 5A and the 5B. And again, just from a kind of a formatting perspective, we've seen the introduction of the schedules and appendices in editable Microsoft Word format so that they can be much more easily customized and edited, as opposed to doing all that on kind of the back end through supplementary conditions. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we covered here today. And that is it. So yeah, thanks for sticking with us. And yeah, Tricia, I'm not sure if any comments have come in, but Kathleen and I are certainly happy to stick around and answer any questions or comments that anybody might have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff and Kathleen. So on your uh, Zoom platform, there is a Q&A section. So if you have any questions or in the chat, you can post them there. That'd be great. It is almost 1 o'clock, so I understand some people need to leave. However, if there's any questions that come in, we can hang around for a few extra minutes. I'm not seeing any so far. I did see, Jeff, in your talk, and Kathleen, that it sounds like there's some updates on the health and safety side of things. We know there was that big ruling with the city of Sudbury. Do you think it's kind of in line with that, trying to understand the owner's responsibilities on construction projects, or?
Yeah, well, that is a great point. I think what I would say is the changes are, I would say, not inconsistent with the new that Sudbury case. The Sudbury case saga is probably a better way to put it. There are so many decisions there that I think have finally come to an end. But what's important there is that, of course, with Sudbury, the court found that the project owner could be held liable for a health and safety incident in its role as employer under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And what you see in the CCDC contracts, you see this was a new clause that was added to the 2020 CCDC 2 2020, and you see it in some of the others as well, is a statement that says nothing in this contract affects, I can't remember the wording exactly, but the kind of the statutory responsibilities and liabilities of the parties under applicable legislation. So I'm glad you raised it, Tricia, because it's an important point just to remember that while we can all say things in a contract in terms of health and safety, who's responsible for what, at the end of the day, your provincial statute, the Occupational Health and Safety Act in the case of Ontario, is ultimately what governs, right? So it's important to remember that, if you're a project owner out there, given this new case law, you do have that liability and potential exposure as a project owner under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, regardless of what you say in your contract, right? So it's always important, I say to owners when I'm helping them draft contracts and procurement documents, it's always important to pay attention to these clauses in your CCDC contract and ensure you modify them to align with your expectations, what you expect of the contractor. But it's important to remember that's not the end of the story, and that there is, you always have to be mindful of what else are we doing to ensure that we're, protecting ourselves, mitigating against risk we have under the statute, which you cannot contract out of. So it's a very important thing always to keep in mind. Yeah.
Thank you. We did have a question asking if we'll be sharing the presentation. I believe OPWA will make this presentation available afterwards, so don't worry about that. We'll be okay there. One of the questions is asking if there's any indication of when CCDC 2 will be updated.
So the 2 was the first of the updates. So it was already updated in 2020. So the CCDC2, the first one was the 2008. It was updated in 2020, and that was really the first domino in all of these updates. And so the two will not, I suspect, not be updated for quite a while because it was already updated to reflect these amendments. So will there be a further update of the two? Maybe. I don't know. I don't have insight on what CCDC's kind of schedule in terms of how they're updating the contracts and what's next on their docket. But I would expect the two would not be updated for a while, and they'll probably go through updating the other contract forms before they get back to the CCDC too. Yeah.
That's actually that's consistent with I've attended some sessions directly with CCDC, and it was interesting when they were talking about this was before these contracts were released, but they before releasing these really stressed the fact that they were doing many of these changes to try to align with the changes they had made to the two, which interestingly they said they weren't able to go on the road and really share with people because it was 2020 and it was obviously not a time when people were traveling and sharing and having conferences and discussions about these. So it was interesting the conversations that they were having at these seminars held by CCDC that they were really suggesting that these mirror the changes that happened in 2020 to the two and were being carried forward throughout the other contract standard forms.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions is, did I hear correctly that the base assumption for the CCDC 5B construction cost option is that it is cost plus GMP?
Yes. So just to clarify, it's the GMP is not the default. So the base assumption is that it's pure cost plus. So the CCDC 5B would be structured on a pure cost plus basis. So you'd be paying costs plus the fee. That's the cost plus. The GMP is only an option if the parties agree on it. So that's not the default. But you can use it if you want to. The parties just have to agree on it, and if they agree on it, that's where those new appendices are relevant. And there is two GMP options. There's a straight GMP where the construction manager is essentially guaranteeing the cost of the project will not exceed a certain threshold. Otherwise, it takes the responsibility for the excess. That's the concept of just the straight GMP. So that's GMP option number one. GMP option number two is that concept plus the shared savings incentive, where if the construction manager brings the costs in below that GMP threshold, there is a savings distribution between the two parties. And so you could use either option, but they're not the default. The default will just be straight construction cost plus the construction manager's fee.
Thank you. Another question for the break free and the 5A contract, is this limited in any way to, for instance, the maximum fee originally agreed upon, or so some set this value as more of a deterrent?
Yeah, another good question. So the way the break fee is structured in the 5A is that it will be a percentage. It will be calculated as a percentage of the construction cost estimate. So and it'll be the construction cost estimate, basically the latest one at the time of when you terminate. So if you're terminating right near the end of pre-construction, right near the end of design, you might have a Class A construction cost estimate. So it would be calculated as a percentage based on the Class A construction cost estimate. Now, what that percentage is, the parties would fill in the 5B form. So it's this new editable field you'll see in the 5A that you would now fill in. So whatever that is, 3%, 5%, 10%, I'm sure that will be an item, that will, be negotiated. So that's essentially what it is. And as Kathleen mentioned, it's, I think in our view, it's really intended to be a reflection of some compensation for the construction manager's lost profit on the balance of the job. So yeah, that's how it's structured.
Yeah, it's very specifically as the amount for such other direct damages to which the construction manager is entitled to. And then it's tiered. So like Jeff said, the fillable fields are tiered. It will literally say this percentage if termination occurs at Class D construction cost budget. So it's tiered and it's filled in.
Okay, perfect. Well, it's 5 after 1. I'm not seeing any more questions come in. So I think with that, we'd on behalf of OPWA, just like to thank Jeff and Kathleen for coming back and doing another great presentation. And yeah, it's always great hearing about the latest updates to contracts and how that affects all of our daily jobs. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.